Welcome, everyone, to today's session, Russia's War in Ukraine. Will it lead to crisis in Moscow? With our distinguished guest, Fiona Hill. Carol Savitz and I will be leading a conversation with Fiona. I'm a professor of history at MIT and faculty director of the MIT Ukraine and program and the co-director of the MIT Eurasia program. Carol is senior fellow at the MIT Security Studies program at the Center for International Studies. So we are very, very happy to have Fiona Hill here. Before I say a word more about our speaker, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the MIT Center for International Studies, the Security Studies program at MIT, the MIT Eurasia program, and the MIT Ukraine program. Special thanks to Michelle English and Sarah Zakaria for all your help making this happen. As our visitors will have seen, we had an intro slide with a QR code about future events. If you missed that, you can go to the CIS website at MIT and find out what else we'll be doing. To all of our listeners, please use the Q&A function if you have questions for the speaker. Please be sure to enter your questions and as succinctly as possible. But now let me introduce our wonderful guest, Fiona Hill. Fiona Hill is a longtime Russia and Ukraine watcher with a PhD in government from Harvard. Her current positions include Chancellor at Durham University in the UK and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute here in Washington, D.C. As many of you probably remember, she served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs in the U.S. National Security Council from 2017 to 2019 under the first Trump administration, as well as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia before that at the U.S. National Intelligence Council from 2006 to 2009. She is the author of the memoir, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, and co-author of two of my favorite books, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, and The Siberian Curse, How Communist Planners Left Russia Out in the Cold, both of them with Clifford Gaddy. And of course, today's conversation couldn't be more timely. So thank you again, Fiona, for joining us. We've got the so-called 28-point peace plan in play with world leaders jet-setting around, trying to make plans. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been meeting with Emmanuel Macron in France, and today the President and Parliament of Ireland. Russian President Vladimir Putin has been huddled in at least 3 hours already in the Kremlin with U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is working hard to figure out Belgian frozen assets and could they be used to support Ukraine. And then my favorite is that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio decided not to go to NATO for their biannual gathering. I learned from the New York Times this morning. But we've got a lot of players working in different angles around this. So I thought our first question to you, Fiona, would be, what is your assessment of the current round of negotiations? The Americans seem to be treating relations with Russia as a series of business interests. Ukrainians respond that their country is not real estate. It has been suffering at war for 11 years of invasion and war. How do you think this balance of business versus strategic or geopolitical considerations might play out?
Well, that's the ultimate question, isn't it, Elizabeth? I guess we'll be in for a lot more surprises along the way, along the lines that you've just laid out here, because it's very difficult to balance out those sets of issues. That's not something that we normally have to feature in these kinds of situations of war and peace. I mean, business is usually something that is discussed at a different point, usually at a different stage, when one thinks about reconstruction or the kind of post-war elements. But there is this kind of sense, this thread that's been going through so much of the discussions around this conflict for some time now, that a lot of places, a lot of countries, and the Trump administration would like to somehow get back to a business as usual sense of interactions with Russia. And of course, there is no business as usual, because we've been in this state of affairs now with a major shift and a major rupture in European security since 2014 and Russia's annexation of Crimea. I mean, we have to remember that's really the opening salvo in this conflict, in this war where we now find ourselves in. So we've been in a really state of war, I would say, since 2014. So for, a considerable period of time at this point, going back over a decade. And that, leads or should lead to the contemplation of this broader set of issues that you've laid out there about the substance of national security and the way that we might find some kind of longer term resolution to this problem, which, as the Ukrainians have rightly pointed out, is not really about real estate. It's about the future of Ukraine as a sovereign, as independent country. The configuration of Ukraine's borders, which let's just put that on the marker now, have been recognized by every country globally, including Russia, for more than 3 decades at this point. There was never previously any kind of claim that was lodged by Russians against Ukraine and its borders and its territory at any point prior to 2014. And of course, all the other countries that became independent more than, again, 3 decades ago as a result of the dissolution of the Soviet Union would have the same questions then about the sanctity of their borders, their sovereignty and independence under the idea that we would be trivializing in some respects Ukraine's hold on its own territory. I mean, the other element beyond Ukraine and Ukraine's future as an independent sovereign country is obviously the future of European security, because this is the third major land war in Europe in a century. So this is a continuation in many respects of World War One. And I think that's really the kind of the frame that we need to think about this again. And we didn't resolve World War One through a whole series of business deals or even World War Two. The Marshall Plan that came in with the reconstruction of Europe was, of course, business was involved in that down the line, but that wasn't the major framing. And we were talking about something consequential, something colossal, something that's going to be shifting the whole future of European security. So it's not going to be something that can be solved through a business deal.
So a lot of people are saying that the timing of the meeting in Moscow today is China. It's not a coincidence given what's happening within Ukraine itself. How do you think the resignation of Yermak, his possible implication in corruption scandal, weakens Zelensky? And I've heard it argued the other way too, that given how weakened he possibly is, that he can't possibly make any concessions now in terms of a peace deal. So how would you assess the Ukrainian side of the ledger right now?
Well, I think, Carol, as you've laid it out, it obviously is a period of acute weakness, which again presents an opportunity, obviously, to Moscow to try to press an advantage here. We've got to remember, not many of the people, I'm sure, on this participant list are quite familiar with, Putin and the way that he operates, and the fact that Putin himself is a master of judo, and he always looks for a point in which he can leverage his opponent and take them to the mat. And this is an obvious one where they've lost their footing in literal sense. Zelensky is on the back foot. Zelensky is having all kinds of problems politically, and I'm picking on Zelensky here because you see both Putin and Trump honing in on Zelensky, seeing him as the person with the weakest hand. Trump has literally said that. I mean, Trump, it's always hard to talk about him without thinking of a pack of cards. And he himself has, raised that multiple times, Trump, by telling Zelensky that he has no cards to play, that he has a weak hand. This obviously isn't judo. We're now talking about, poker and all kinds of other games. But there is a gamble, a gambit, let's put it that way, going on right now, particularly from Moscow, but also, frankly, from Washington, D.C., that this is the moment to push through, getting back to Elizabeth's question, some kind of deal that basically gets Ukraine off this war footing and gets this war into a different phase entirely. And I would just say that it is not just Russia that's trying to go in at this particular moment of vulnerability for Ukraine, but also for the United States. It's no secret, and Trump makes it no secret, that he's fed up of this war. He wants it to end. And there's he famously said he wanted to end it within 24 hours of coming into office. He thought it would be easy. At every different juncture, the course of negotiations or the course of discussions around this war, all of the spectacles we've seen have been driven by a large part by Trump's desires to have some symbolic date or some symbolic event to drive a peace process, or at least a ceasefire, or whatever it is that he thinks he's wanting to have a deal to be made. The latest one, of course, was Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving, which isn't celebrated anywhere other than in America. But Trump, obviously wanted to have that as a symbolic date for him. And of course, many people are uncharitably saying, but he himself is alluding to this, that he would like to get something in under the wire so we can be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And those deadlines are coming up in January. So, sad to say, all of this is being driven by other considerations, which are not the considerations on the battlefield. And it's now, look, we can look at the battlefields, I think, also in multiple ways. I'm sure lots of people are thinking about that. There's the actual battlefields on the front lines, where Russia does make incremental progress, but enormous cost to Russia. I mean, that's why we have the title of this discussion, as we were talking about it previously. That it's not that Russia is doing this cost-free. The losses in terms of manpower and equipment material are enormous, but it's a price that Putin is willing to pay, because Putin is pretty confident that he's eventually going to have success. But for Ukraine, it isn't holding the lines in the way that it was before, but there's no sign of an imminent collapse of Ukraine on the battlefield. This isn't like, the collapse of the lines in World War I, for example. I mean, yes, it's a grind and it's pretty terrible, very terrible for Ukraine in terms of the front lines and the civilian losses and the damage to its critical national infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. But, I've just talked this morning to a colleague that, others would know here, who's just returned from a period in Kiev, and said there's no sense there that they're ready to give up the ghost. They accept that this is a really tough situation. But the political battlefield, is a different matter from the actual front line right now. Yes, again, we've said moment of weakness, but the political battlefield extends beyond Kiev. It's also in Europe. And another sense of vulnerability, Elizabeth, you mentioned all the different places that people are, right now. Putin has just today excoriated the Europeans, saying, they're feckless, they're trying to destroy this peace process, they have no role to play, despite the fact this is all about European security. They're just trying to bring down this, peace agreement, this deal between the Russia and the United States. They're in favor of war, because this is also, again, a period of acute vulnerability for the Europeans. I mean, it's interesting that Zelensky is in Ireland, of all places. Ireland doesn't have a military. Ireland is famous for its neutrality. But, this is also a period where the Irish, the Swiss, all kinds of other countries are famously neutral. And the Swiss are different from the Irish, obviously, because they actually do have a rather, sizable military and a significant defense industry. But they're all thinking about neutrality can't mean passivity, that this is a real challenge to the whole of Europe and to that whole post-World War II and post-Cold War set of arrangements that seem to be guaranteeing stability, certainty, prosperity, and a benign security environment for Europe. And it's anything but that. And, the Irish are perhaps not deciding to arm themselves again, but I think they're starting to also think about whether they should be playing a more assertive diplomatic role at this point. But the whole debate in Europe is very hot at this moment. And I think Putin is desperately trying to, perhaps not so desperately, but, in a very deliberate fashion, let's say, deliberately trying to intimidate Europeans, to push them back, get them on the back foot as well, get them down on the mat, and trying to stop them from playing any kind of assertive role in this process. And, related to that, we've also got the propaganda and informational battlefield. And frankly, Putin wins that hands down all the time. The framing for all of this, the questions about the future of Ukraine, the questions about corruption in Kiev, the questions about Ukraine on the battlefield, they're all framed by Russia and Russian propaganda. There's no corruption in Russia? Really? Excuse me? Kind of what about all of the, the scandals that used to be revealed there all the time? Of course, one of the people who was always revealing those, Alexei Navalny, has been very conveniently killed, by the system. For example, we get very little out about the kinds of scandals, although we know they're there because Putin prosecutes people who've obviously been helping themselves a little bit too much generously, to all of, the various finances. But Putin is also playing very heavily into corruption here in the United States. The peace plan, all of the discussions are involving business people and many people who would at some point stand to benefit in many different ways from the reconstruction of either the ruined parts of Ukraine that Russia has absorbed and is hoping to get recognition of, or future reconstruction in Ukraine. The 28-point peace plan that sent everybody's minds whirring was very clear that there was going to be a sharing of the spoils between, there's the business deal for you, Elizabeth, that is attempting to frame this, between a coterie of American business people and their counterparts in Russia. So we've got a lot going on here: financial games, economic games, battlefields. They're trying to incentivize people, sweeten the pot for people to get involved. But propaganda and information is pretty important as well, because we're not asking, although we did in this title of this talk, about really, what's going on, in Russia and elsewhere. It's all about how Ukraine is about to lose all the time, even though, again, there have been colossal losses for Russia, not just, again, in the battlefield, but also in terms of its reputation, in terms of its inability to prosecute what Putin wanted to be a special military operation that was also going to be over in days. Trump wanted to solve the war in 24 hours. Putin thought he would have Kiev and Ukraine under control in a bit more time than that, but certainly, perhaps 24 days. Certainly not, months and years, and creating the largest war in Europe since World War II.
Or can I just follow up based on something that Fiona said? What do you see as the role of Europe in all of this? There's a lot of speculation that if Trump actually withdraws any U.S. support from Ukraine, can the Europeans help Ukraine out? And what does the future look like in terms of that? You talked about Putin intimidating Europe. Is Europe really willing to step up, and can it maintain its own unity in the face of what could be its direct involvement in the war?
Now, well, just talking about Europe is already the problem, right? I mean, you're about Eurasia, which is also one of those slightly amorphous and sometimes ill-defined regions. And Europe, we know what it is geographically, and Ukraine is definitely part of Europe, and so is is Russia, at least not just geographically, but also politically. But institutional Europe is all over the place. We have the European Union, and there's all this discussion about Ukraine joining the European Union as part of any kind of settlement, and Europeans taking, some responsibility in a major way for through the European Union for the reconstruction and longer term health of, what Ukraine looks like at the end of, of this. It's hard again to see where that end might be, but the European Union is not a security provider. Yes, within the European Union, articles of association, there are security provisions, but they're all linked, one way or another to NATO or to, other entities. And the European security provisions usually towards confidence and, security building, focused on, disasters or disaster management or, intervention in conflicts, which are not at this scale, not full-scale war management. They were thinking, obviously, in the kind of wake of what happened in former Yugoslavia and, kind of European intervention in conflicts globally, about something, quite different, confidence, peace building, etc. This is, again, the realm that would fit the other institution, of course, which is NATO. And this is where we get to the crux of a set of other problems that, Carol, you probably would have got to, but, weren't quite there in that question. Because I think it's become apparent now that the United States doesn't think of itself as part of NATO, at least Trump doesn't. And Witkoff and others in the 28-point plan had this rather surprising line about the United States mediating between Russia and NATO. Now, we've got, of course, we still theoretically had the NATO-Russia Council, but it wasn't mediated by the United States on, between NATO and Russia. It was with the United States as firmly part of NATO at that particular point, going back to that period in the 1990s when there wasn't a question that US was part of NATO. But now Trump seems to be, when he's talking about an Article 5 guarantee, it's not clear what he means, right? He's talking about the nuclear guarantee, the ultimate nuclear umbrella, the provision of tactical nuclear weapons, the dual capable aircraft that the Europeans have, that the US provides nuclear missiles for. Of course, we have France and Britain having nuclear arsenals, but they're a fraction of the US capability. And Trump hasn't said that he's pulled away the nuclear guarantee from Europe, but he certainly raised questions about everything else. Now, does he still think of Canada as part of NATO is another question as well, given all of the discussions about Canada by Trump as part of the United States, the 51st state, and all these other rather shocking overtures that he's made towards Canada. So it may be that he doesn't think of NATO as including Canada, so that the North Atlantic portion of it is that North Atlantic portion that obviously wouldn't include Greenland either, but would be, north of the United Kingdom, Iceland, Norway, etc., etc. But he's making it very clear that he thinks that NATO is really Europe and Europe's capacity. And we remember, and I think that may unfortunately be also another signal that we get from Rubio not going to NATO, as Elizabeth has pointed out to the meeting. The last NATO meeting was all about Europe stepping up. Article 5 became Article 5%. You don't get defence or collective defence unless you're paying 5%. 1.5 of that 5% is supposed to be for resilience, kind of for building up the wherewithal for Europe to defend itself and to withstand all of the challenges that they have coming down the pike. But, there was an understanding that Europe was going to be taking charge of European security. Now, we all know, and many people, I looked down the participant list here as well, we all know about these debates. I mean, this is the kind of thing that MIT security studies, students will have been learning. I certainly did back in the day, that for decades after, including, after the beginning of the Cold War, the 1950s, the next 60s onwards, there's been this debate about how much Europe should have been doing and whether, it was still the right response to have the United States putting basically the bill in many respects on so many different fronts and also bearing the largest share of the burden for European security. I mean, this is obviously the artifact and the consequence of Europe being bailed out from World War I and then World War II. And it is a really good question as to whether 100 years on, the United States should still be bailing Europe out of European security. But the dilemma that we have here is, of course, getting back to your question, Carol, is that the United States has taken it upon himself, and Trump has taken it upon himself, to basically be the decider, the deal maker in this conflict, at the same time as he's actually also saying that it's Europe's responsibility for its own security. So those two things don't square at all. If you're making a deal between the United States and Russia, which is frankly what this is, then, and you're telling the Europeans that they need to stand up, and take responsibility for European security, as they frankly should have been, the past 30 odd, years, not just cashing into the peace dividend and letting all of their investment in at least their defensive posture and their deterrence, decline to really drastic levels. Then, you've got to have Europe taking the ball forward, frankly, on these questions about the future of security for Ukraine, not just for Europe. When we move forward here. And again, who should be doing this? And that's again where we get back to these problems of what is Europe, who is Europe. We've got a coalition of countries, we're calling it right now the E3, which is a kind of the classic UK, Germany and France, which are playing a key role. But we've got loads of other European countries that have got a vested interest in this, from the Baltic states to Poland, which is very close to spending right now 5%. It may have even hit 5% of GDP in its defence. We've obviously got the Scandinavian countries, where the Joint Expeditionary Force that the UK was leading, which includes all of the Scandinavian and the Baltic countries, that have been playing a very active role in Ukraine. And we've got Italy, which has been playing a rather surprisingly forceful role at times on the issue of Ukraine. Of course, then we've got other countries, Slovakia, Hungary and others, which is not so much, or the Spanish, who don't really see this as the threat to their security that others do. Right. So we're looking here at a dilemma, because Europe ought to be and must be taking more responsibility here. They can't afford to leave it to a US-Russia deal, which frankly isn't taking their interests into consideration. And we've got a bit of a problem as to where is the right locus for this initiative. We've got Ursula von der Leyen in the mix, from the EU perspective. We've got Mark Rutte as the General Secretary of NATO. And then we've got a kind of constellation of people like the President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, who comes in extremely handy because he's got a mean game of golf, and can engage with Trump on numerous has been deployed with golf clubs, quite frequently to try to, turn the course of events. We've got Giorgia Meloni, in Italy, as I've kind of mentioned here. But what we really haven't got is real serious leadership, and that's also a consequence in part of the very troubled relationship that all of Europe, frankly, now has with the United States. apart from Viktor Orban, who's always sucking up to Trump, frankly, let's just put it as honestly as that. But everybody else is either being tariffed or excoriated or criticized, for their politics. And, the people around the Trump administration, Trump himself at times, are interfering directly in European politics and supporting populist, leaders and parties. And of course, all the tariffs and all the economic pressure that's being put on Europe is making it extraordinarily difficult for Europeans to get their act together. So, in short, this is a mess.
Thank you for that scientific term. Yes,
that's the succinct answer. Is it's a mess,
right.
And there's no kind of clear way out of this because we're really kind of lacking in a really well-structured leadership on the part of Europeans rather than Europe per se.
Yeah. Let me bring it back to the Ukrainians and to Russians. I'm curious if you have any assessment. Do the Ukrainians, in your view, what cards can they play? How can they make themselves a key player at the table? And what are Russia's weaknesses? You alluded to some of them, but I'd be curious to hear, because one of their information war strategies is to say they're winning, Pokrovsk, et cetera, they're always naming something that they're winning. But in fact, we know Ukrainians are reaching well into Russia. They're hitting key infrastructure. They're hitting missile production, drone production, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious, what is your sense of what the Ukrainians can do, both perhaps militarily, but also politically and diplomatically? And what are the Russian weaknesses? Are they really coming to the table now because they're actually weak, although they'll never show it? Or are they coming to the table, in fact, in a position of strength? How do you hold back to our two original players? Thanks for the European part, though. It's very important. What do we do? What do we think about that?
Yeah, I mean, all of these are interrelated. I mean, the problem is about the table. It's Trump's table. He set it, and it's for his deadlines, and that's kind of part of the problem that we keep having to deal with here. So we're getting an agenda set by someone who really isn't interested in Ukraine's perspective, and is frankly, again, looking at it from a totally different vantage point. He's looking at it for a deal. He's looking at it as a businessman's perspective. He sees Ukraine as a losing proposition because it's a losing proposition for him, from his perspective of the US, although that's not a view that's necessarily shared by the whole of the United States. Let's be honest about this. There's 330 million people. We've all got views, and members of Congress and the Senate, and different people around his administration have different views as well. We see all of that playing out, but it's Trump's table. And everybody's being pushed to come to it and to try to kind of see if they can shift the menu around. So, there's that problem. Now, I want to flip this a little bit into thinking about Russia first, because Russia is, as we all know, never as weak as it appears, never as strong as it appears, but it's incredibly durable. Russia it's never collapsed, has it really? Let's think about it. I mean, it still remains the largest country on earth. It's gone through different forms. We've still got vestiges of Russian Empire there, of the Soviet Union. I remember, back in the day when I was at Harvard, Carol, when you were there, when we were at the Davis Center, I took, like many people, Adam Ulam's course about, continuity in, Russia.
Right.
Politics and history and all the rest of it. And I think all of us would admit, that Russia has got persistence, it's got staying power. It expands, it shrinks a bit, it expands again. It's constantly, as Putin's saying, when he always talks about Russia's borders, he's getting at that essence of this kind of point that Russia is always there somewhere, and it's always kind of menacing. It's mostly kind of in its whole of history that the bits of it that we all kind of focus on are the bits where it's really expanding, really rather than contracting. But Russia is always in a state of some degree of crisis. Even at calm times, there's always something going on beneath the surface. It's a big place to keep together. And Putin, getting back to what we said before, he thought he was going to have not perhaps a cakewalk, but he thought he was going to be repeating some of the episodes, the more promising episodes of Russia's conquering past. And that, he saw that Kiev and Ukraine were extremely vulnerable. Look, when I was in government, I never really got briefings about the state of the Ukrainian military, only about the state of the Russian military. And I doubt greatly that Putin got any briefings about the state of the Ukrainian military. And if he did, they would obviously be all kind of highlighting the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses, not the inherent strengths. And we've got to remember that the Ukrainian military is built up on the basis also of the Soviet military, just like Russia is. Now, Carol, you probably remember, and others who are on this participant list might remember, when I was back in the 1990s working at the Kennedy School, and also, the Davis Center and Ukrainian Research Institute, we had Konstantin Morozov, Russian-speaking, Ukrainian, formerly part of the Soviet military, and he became the first defense minister of Ukraine. And he was a Russian speaker, and I spent a lot of time with him, as many others did. I think you did as well, Carol. And he was trying to build up a Ukrainian army. I mean, they know the Russian army inside out. There were so many people who were Ukrainian, of Ukrainian heritage. There might have been Russian speakers, but Ukrainian heritage, who had, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, this sense that they were going to build up their own military. They already had capacities and capabilities. Russia was relying on a lot of their heavy lift, for long periods of time, as Russia was building up its own forces. You think about that huge Ukrainian aircraft, which was one of the first things that the Russians took out when they attacked Ukraine in February of 2022. Their intention was to take over again that military capability and capacity of Ukraine. It wasn't to destroy everything, which is what they're kind of doing now. And so we have, I think, right fundamentally from the very beginning, made as George Bush would have said, a misunderestimation of Ukrainian potential capacity, based on the fact that we saw Russia as a successor state from the Soviet Union, forgot that the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before it was an agglomeration, an aggregate of all of all of these other parts. And Ukrainians, like Armenians and Kazakhs and Georgians, were all actually, fairly well integrated into the Soviet armed forces, and many of them were the leaders, and they've got, basically capacities as well. And Ukraine was the arsenal, in many respects, of the Soviet armed forces. And now this is kind of what I want to get to as well. Ukraine and Ukrainians are one of the best equipped, best trained, and most formidable armies in Europe. The Turks and the Finns have got their own capacity as well because of, wartime. And Turkey's always maintained a pretty large military. And remember, it's part of NATO, if we're not thinking about this in European context. And Carol, you've worked on Turkey, kind of in the past, and the Middle East, to a very large extent. So I think you would agree with me there. I mean, the Turkey is a substantial, military force still, and has obviously been in action, although, we kind of not probably highlight it in this way in places like Syria, and elsewhere, and, its concerns about what's going on more broadly. The Finns never let their guard down after the Winter War and always made sure that they had the reserve force and were always trained. And you could say the same for the Swedes and the Norwegians to, a lesser extent to the Finns, of course. But, while everybody else was cashing in on the peace dividend and, allowing their militaries to atrophy, which is pretty much everywhere else, including the Poles, the Finns, as I said, and the Turks and others weren't doing that. And the Ukrainians have had to build up over the last 4 years now a pretty formidable fighting force. And they're at the front lines of innovation. So, they're not got those giant heavy lift aircraft anymore. They've moved into the world of drones. We've moved beyond tanks, perhaps, and aircraft carriers. And, the Ukrainians have been able to take out about a third of the Russian Black Sea Fleet using, autonomous, maritime drones, submersibles. They've constantly innovating on the battlefield. Yes, the Russians have caught up, but we've got to remember, again, that Ukraine and the Ukrainian military, these are it's a European country and a European fighting force. It would be foolish for the Europeans to want to see Ukraine basically diminished, demilitarized, and neutered at the end of all this, because Ukraine is the only, and it's way ahead of the United States as well, frankly. There are a lot of US defense base. Look, and I'm not saying this is a warmongering, just to be very clear for anybody who's going to start weighing in on all of this. The reality is that as a result of this battle, just like in World War II, when the United States wasn't as particularly innovative in World War I, by the way. It just came in as a fresh military force with its cavalry and all the rest of it. But in World War II, that arsenal of war, World War II, was all in Detroit. It was in the Midwest. Remember, there's that great book about the arsenal of democracy, and the United States innovation came as a result of its participation in World War II, and the United States maintained that edge after that. Well, Ukraine is doing that now. It's not the United States, it's Ukraine, because Ukraine is being forged horribly in battle. And so that's, kind of something we have to bear in mind here. And that's something that the Ukrainians can do and others can do, is to point that out. That Ukraine is fighting here, and the Ukrainians will say that, for the future of Europe and European security. That's absolutely right. I mean, remember that World War One, that wasn't fought in Germany, it wasn't fought in the United Kingdom. It had crippling effects on both the United Kingdom and Germany. Germany is the loser, and the UK is sent to be as a victor, but it was the beginning and the end, or really the real end of the British Empire and all of the other empires around Europe. But World War II was a totally different game. It really shifted, as I said, all of that focus to the United States, also in European security. And Ukraine is the battlefield, like World War One again, for the next phase of European security, sadly. And there's where, Russia has proven to be vulnerable. Russia didn't kick Ukraine's ass as it thought it would. I mean, there were some people like Ben Hodges and others who said that it wouldn't be that easy for Russia, and that Ukrainians would fight back, and that Ukraine, would prove many of the naysayers wrong. And it's not the case that it's just because of US support. And of course, that has been consequential, and European support. But the rate of innovation and the innovation is all happening in Ukraine, itself. Again, war is not to be celebrated, but I'm just pointing out here that there is something fundamental taking place. And I think that that's another reason why Putin wants this to end, and that it's not being seen strategically, certainly not from the United States and the White House, but perhaps also not by Europe. Although, you want to ask why the Italians interested. Well, it's not just Giorgia Meloni. Italy has one of the largest defense industries in Europe, so do the Swiss. Leonardo, famously named after, I presume, Leonardo da Vinci, are very interested in what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. You're seeing defense contractors and defense industry from, around Europe and the United States paying attention, even if, at the strategic level, some of the governments are not paying attention to this. And again, this is kind of part of the problem we're facing. And the other, vulnerability, then adding this into Russia, as Russia's been trying to keep pace with Ukraine and has caught up in many respects. Remember at the beginning of the war, it had to rely on Iran for Shahed drones.
Right.
And it was very much dependent on China, and still is, for some parts and things like this. And on the battlefield, bringing in North Koreans, to help fight, especially in Kursk. Russia has turned a bulk of its economy now to basically feed the war. And one of the big vulnerabilities for Russia down the line is, how do you reverse that? Do you want to reverse that? And Russia arms sales was a big portion of Russia's foreign exchange beyond oil and gas. But right now it's been consuming all of that arms production. So is Russia going to be then the arms purveyor to the world, at the end of this war? What does it do with all the demobilized soldiers? What does it do with, that massive defense industry that it's built up? I mean, it had a hard enough time going, from making tanks to washing machines, in the 1990s. In fact, never really succeeded there. And, the Ukrainians are giving, Russia a run for its money in terms of innovation. And not from the state level, because the Ukrainians are doing this on the battlefield, and we have seen Russia, under Belousov as the Minister of Defense, taking a businessman's view on this and pushing innovation. But Russia's going to be very vulnerable, beyond the war, in terms of its economy, because everything has been pushed towards this. That was a long answer, but I think there was a lot packed into, what you were saying there. And I think often we look at this, from a specific set of angles, and we kind of forgetting, that 28-point plan. Remember, originally Russia wanted the military of Ukraine to be brought down to, what was it, under 100,000? If you think about the British Armed Forces, only 76, thousand in terms of on the army, the land army. You've got a lot more in, in other forces. But Ukraine's got, almost, what is it now? It's more than 800,000, which was in the peace plan, the 28-point peace plan. Russia's army is, on paper, what, million plus, but, we know that in, kind of real life, they're not always, to that extent. But Ukraine's got more people under arms. And I say people because not just men, right? It's also women, and it's more of a whole of society impact than any other European country.
Right. So you sort of foreshadowed a couple of other questions that Elizabeth and I had planned to ask. So I think that we should turn to our audience. And we have several questions that basically ask you to speculate. And I was going to ask you to speculate too about, given everything that you've said, where do you think we'll be in 18 months or 2 years? Will there be some kind of deal, not deal, favorable to Russia, Ukraine, worked out, not worked out? Will the war continue? And then what are the implications if the war continues?
You'd have the potential to keep on going. Based on everything that I've said, and absent some major shift. Now we've seen a major shift, which is the re-election of Trump. For Putin, my God, what a payday! Because it's given him, the kind of opportunity to really manipulate on the propaganda, political, and information battlefield, in a ways that, he hasn't had before. Other major shifts, politics in Europe, for example, the weakness, let's just be honest, of the main European players, perhaps not so much in the Scandinavian countries, or the Baltic states, but real political weakness in the UK, in Germany, absolutely in France, where Macron, can't get another term, and, we've got so much, questions about where the future of France will be, but also Poland, where you still got that standoff between the right and the left. Politics in Europe gives an awful lot of potential for everything to basically fall apart here from the support for Ukraine. So that's kind of obviously what Putin's gambling on. He's feeling that he can keep this going on his side for as long as possible. He keeps saying it. Look, he says it openly that he doesn't, have to go for peace right now. He's really the big obstacle here. As everybody says, he could stop it if he wanted to. I'm not sure that he wants to because of some of these other issues that I've said here, the demobilization, the demilitarization of the Russian economy. At this point, what's incentives to do that? And he's hoping for that major shift on the politics, if not on the battlefield. Where we can see that over a longer period of time, at the rate that Russia's moving now, it can take more and more territory, but it still is far short of the kind of mythical annexation of all the territory that Russia's already made. The declaration that all of the Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk, and Zaporizhia and Kherson, in addition to Crimea, are part of the Russian Federation. That doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But Putin is hoping that politically that will come to pass because of changes elsewhere. So if those changes prove to be catastrophic for support for Ukraine, and there's more problems in Ukraine itself, absolutely things could keep on shifting in Putin's direction. And Trump will keep on pressing that Ukraine for him is a losing proposition, and if Europeans are not able to step up, then we see more likely on the trajectory that we're on that, Ukraine will find it very difficult to resist, basically giving up territory. And then we still have this problem of who's going to, give Ukraine security guarantees. Right. I think there's one important element here that actually a colleague raised with me this morning that they pointed out that, it's obvious to all of us, but it hasn't been pointed out. But this is really kind of unique in Russian history, and probably in the history of most countries, that Russia was paying its soldiers enormous amounts to fight this war. If we think back as historians to previous wars, you always give conscripts, volunteers. They're not being paid, as contractors or as mercenaries to fight in the war. And that's essentially what we're seeing in Russia. Putin is basically gambling that he has enough money to keep on paying people to go to the front. And that's taking the edge off social discontent, until the war ends, because then people are going to still get those payments for coming back home again. So war has become lucrative, not just for the people who profit from it, in the defense sector or skim money off, and we're seeing all of that in Ukraine, but for those people who go to die at the front. I mean, for Ukraine, this is an existential, literally existential question about going to fight at the front. But for Russians, it's now an issue of pay. And I think part of that is because Putin himself is a fairly astute historian of Russia and previous wars. World War II was an existential fight because that's the fight that came to Russia, or the Soviet Union rather. I mean, to all of Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Armenia and everywhere else. But World War I wasn't fought really in Russia. It was fought on the kind of the margins, but it was fought in other places. And at that point, you had an army of people who were forced into the army for a 25-year period, and it was pretty awful. And that was the essence of the revolution. You're not getting people now baying for peace in Russia, bread, for the, for the peasants, and peace for the soldiers, and land for the peasants and bread for the workers. You're not getting those kinds of slogans because Putin's taken the edge off. Particularly if you're in Moscow, it's looking pretty nice. And out there in the provinces, you've got all this money from payments from the front, blood money, that's kind of sloshing around there for now. I mean, yes, we're hearing stories that some of this is becoming more difficult to make, but Putin's betting that he can do this for that 1.5, 2, 3 years, Carol, that you're kind of laying out there. So, I mean, I think that's kind of why we're seeing Putin playing along or playing Trump along and playing all of these politics as much as he possibly can. I mean, he can keep paying for this. He'd probably prefer not to. But he also then has that dilemma about what does he do when he doesn't pay for this anymore? I mean, there is again, this can Putin afford peace? For now, he thinks he can afford war, but can he afford peace? And that's, kind of becomes all of the kind of questions about, do Europeans want to basically start trading with Russia again? Are they going to be forced to? Is there going to be some paying Russia for devastating Europe? I mean, we had the Marshall Plan. We rebuilt Germany, but we're occupying Germany. No one's going to be occupying Russia. So there's same with Japan. Could we look for a kind of a durable peace there? If you think about Japan still doesn't have a peace treaty with Russia. Since World War II, by the way, there was never the conclusion of a peace between Russia, the Soviet Union, and Japan, and then there wasn't a peace between Russia and Japan, even though one was supposed to be drawn up by the year 2000 by Yeltsin. That never happened. Could we end up in a state of peace and war, or peace not war rather, of a kind of Japan, kind of Russia state? But of course, Japan was heavily invested in. The US has still got military installations in Okinawa and elsewhere, in Japan. It's just kind of hard to see how we make all of this work under these circumstances. Again, as I said, without some major change, which Putin's hoping is going to be in his favor, or just some really, really hard work and a lot of commitment on the part of Europeans, not just the United States. And right now, the politics of within European countries are pretty weak. You'd really need to have somebody basically take up the mantle here. Maybe Alexander Stubb with his golf clubs, turned into something else. But somebody who really, can come forward on some real leadership here to get some change. And you've really got to constrain Putin's ability to basically keep having these funds to pay for war. Because Putin is paying for this war because it's worth it to him. And it seems to be not really worth it to everybody else to pay in different ways to stop him from being able to keep on pushing forward.
And I think that's key about what can constrain Putin and what other sanctions. Some people are doing research on other parts that could be sanctioned. But I'm curious, this discussion of Europe is absolutely critical and important. But we've got a question from the audience about U.S. Congress and the intelligence community. We have questions about that too. You've worked with both. What would get the Ukrainian faction in Congress or the Senate to step up and try to move Trump somewhere? Are there other intelligence forces that you know of that can push him not to be so transactional, so business oriented, so frankly willing to give in to Russia. And I mean, one could, I don't know if you want to go into this, ask about the corruption of the U.S. Congress or U.S. people like Witkoff. And, what are there any forces that you see that could push this to a more, dare I say, just peace, secure peace, not just a peace about, taking but Russia has always been paranoid about them biting off pieces of Russia, and now that's exactly what they want to do with Ukraine: is bite off as much pieces as they can. What can stop them? Are there countervailing forces, or are we sort of stuck with this Trump-centric model, as you've said?
Stuck. And in fact, I mean, I think it's probably not, I wouldn't try to say the Ukraine faction in Congress, because I think what it is Congress remembering that they are the number one locus of power in the US Constitution. That would be nice. We've got the 250th
War and peace.
anniversary. Yeah. Exactly. We've got the 250th anniversary of American independence. And I don't recall, I mean, I'm a naturalized citizen, so I did have to read the Constitution. I did have to have a citizenship test. And nowhere was there a question about, is there only one person who matters in the United States? There isn't, right? And I think over a whole period of time, certainly the time that I've lived in the US, 1989 onwards, we've seen the fetishization of the US presidency. Yes, the US president is the commander-in-chief, the head of state, but is also supposed to be the chief executive. But they are not the sole locus of power. Really, the preeminent power lies with Congress as the representation of the American people in the Constitution. And the members of Congress have forgotten that, on the Democratic side as well as on the Republican side. I mean, now that both of the mainstream parties are in crisis, like mainstream parties anywhere else in the West at the moment, they're umbrellas. They're just vehicles for electing a president. They're not really doing their job, any of them, in terms of representing American people. And that's what American members of Congress need to remember, that they're supposed to be representatives of you, me, and everybody else on here, and they're supposed to be also playing a role in issues related to security. And that's an issues related to war and peace, and not just ceding that to the president. So we have many branches of government, and I think the biggest boost for any of this would be for those members of those branches of government to remember that they have a responsibility, that they've taken an oath to the Constitution, and that they should be paying attention to the future of the United States. Now, I don't think that the United States should be carrying all of the burdens of European security. I mean, I'm very much of the view, and have been right since the very beginning, that it is absolutely accurate that Europe has let itself down, not just let the United States down. And that, again, I totally sympathise and empathise with that whole idea that we had a peace burden, rather dividend, rather than the burdens of the Cold War that seemed extraordinarily attractive. I arrived in the United States in 1989, just as I was in class at Harvard as the wall came down, and we felt optimistic. We thought great things were going to happen. It hasn't turned out quite as we hoped. As that great Victor Chernomyrdin aphorism, we hope for the best, but it all turned out as usual. It's kind of gone down dark paths, and that means that we've got to take more responsibility. And Europeans, not just as a result of the annexation of Crimea, but a long time before, should have been paying attention that the world was full of perils, and that it couldn't be just outsourcing their security to the United States. It wasn't fair, for one thing, and it was a stupid security move. I think if you look at Europe, there's been so many mistakes that have been made. Reliance on Russian gas for Germany and many other countries, for example. Outsourcing all of the trade to China, is another. And just thinking the Chinese market is going to be there as a kind of an export market forever. And relying on the United States for security, to the detriment of that relationship. And the United States infantilized Europeans, as a result of all of that. And it's been a long time to step up here. So that is definitely something that we still have to pay attention to. But look, we're in a very difficult situation here, where a lot of hard choices have to be made. And here in the United States, a lot of hard choices are going to have to be made too, because we have prospered. We have benefited from the United States playing some leading role in world affairs. And I would posit that as we pull back and withdraw, or we kind of engage in a very haphazard fashion, we focus on, overthrowing Maduro in Venezuela, or, aspirations to annex Canada and Greenland and, take back the Panama Canal, returning to the, foreign policy of McKinley, for example, or, Monroe, or whatever else it is that Trump may or may not have in his mind. And we play spheres of influence and, say, here, Putin, you have Europe, not just all of Eastern Europe, but just take it. We're not interested, kind of. We'll find that it will be less easy to have that kind of influence without responsibility. Maybe that's all what we all want, but I think that should be a debate in Congress. It should be a debate by our representatives. Maybe that is right, that Americans would like to have no more responsibility for world affairs, but then we're just going to have to accept that we can't just terrify our way then to a better position around the globe. Part of the reason that we've been so prosperous for the best part of a century, certainly since the end of World War II, is because we shaped global institutions. It is the end now of Pax Americana. There's no question about it. And Trump is trying to position himself, as much as anything else, but also the United States to just, take as much of the spoils as he possibly can. But, without that responsibility, without that kind of perspective and acknowledgement, that's kind of what we're going to play. I don't think that we're going to find ourselves in a very propitious position. We're going to end up being, takers rather than shapers of, global economy and world affairs. We already had the G20 take place without the United States. And, if it's going to be in Miami next year, the US has decided that they're going to excommunicate basically South Africa from this, who was the chair of the G20 this year. Do they really think that everybody's going to send, their leaders here? So I think that the US is looking like a very different country now, and other countries are going to be interacting with the United States in Europe and elsewhere in very different ways. And so for things to kind of really change, it would really take, again, members of Congress and other, branches of the US government, and frankly, a national conversation. It could be happening at the state level, not just, universities like here at MIT, governors and others really asking a kind of question about what kind of United States do people want to live in. And we've got to remember that so many of the states, the United States, also rely on international trade. I was in Idaho not so long ago, in Moscow, Idaho, the University of Idaho, and I was looking at the museum that they have there towards, pulses and beans. It's like a interesting thing that, as a nerd like me, I kind of like to go into and look at. I had no idea that Idaho was the lentil capital of the world. More lentils grown in Idaho than anywhere else. Are they all being consumed in the United States? No, they're not. The biggest export markets to India. All of these things have knock-on effects. That there's going to be, some pretty serious consequences from the US that's playing a kind of strange game in world affairs, for people who are just going about having their livelihoods. I imagine that farmers in Idaho will be wondering, what other crops, because it's not like Americans are really into eating mung beans and lentils in a large way. So there's all kinds of ways in which, we wouldn't normally think about it, that we're going to be affected by this. And that's getting back to, your question. It would take not thinking about just Ukraine, but thinking about US role in the world to really have something of a change there.
So on that note, we've reached the end of our hour. Fiona, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about and really left us with almost lots more questions than answers, not only how the war in Ukraine actually plays out over the next year or two, what will happen with Putin, what will happen with Zelensky, and then, of course, the role of the Europeans and the role of the United States. So I hope everybody will join me in thanking Fiona. We have several things that we're cooking up for next semester, so please stay tuned and we'll let you know about the next seminars at the beginning of MIT's semester in February. So Fiona, thank you so much.
No, thanks so much for having me. And I'm sorry I left us on the thought of mung beans and lentils, but anyway, you never know where you're going to end up, right?
Right. And the US role is obviously much more complex than people are willing to admit and look at. So I think
this is about our future of ourselves. And I think that's the kind of, will this all call a crisis in Russia is one question. But we have to think about, some of our own crises at home. or issues at home, and now they're all intertwined with this too. And it's those second, third order consequences that we rarely think of.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. And we can't be fetishizing the president all the time, even if that's what he wants.
Exactly.
Oh,
Right.
thank you
So,
so much. This was fabulous.
Great
Thank
to be
you.
with all of you.
And happy
Yeah.
holidays to everyone
Thanks
too.
to everyone
Thank
as
you.
well. Best wishes.